By now, you might be familiar with the Hays Code, and how the trickle-down of censorship from the 20s led to the modern landscape of media today. For a super detailed overview on how the Hays Code came to be and its impact on the animation space and queer representation, you can find that linked below. The short version goes something like this. During the 1920s, the motion picture industry in the United States changed drastically by the implementation of the Motion Picture Production Code, or, you guessed it, the Hays Code. Religious leaders banded together to form local censorship boards that included all media programming that was then enforced by ex-Postmaster General Will Hays. After resigning from his post in President Harding's cabinet in 1922 due to scandal, he became the first chairman of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. His goal? To clean up the pictures, thanks to his conservative credentials, including his roles as a Presbyterian deacon and chairman of the Republican Party. To the modern moviegoer, it might seem a little odd that media of the era was seen as scandalous when pictures in the 20s are pretty tame compared to today's standards. I mean, the Kardashians hadn't even gotten to the E! Network yet. The public image of Hollywood at the time, however, had started to take a turn with prohibition and profound social change. Drug and sex scandals about movie stars were featured frequently in popular newspapers, and film directors and producers were beginning to test the limits of what could be shown on screen. Pushing these boundaries prompted more calls to make censorship official. To meet the demand for decent programming, Hollywood studios banded together under Will Hays to formally introduce the Production Code Administration, or PCA, in the 1930s. The PCA would be responsible for enforcing a list of 36 self-imposed don'ts and be carefuls. The Hays Code, written by a Jesuit priest and Catholic publisher, was designed as, quote, a code regulating the moral content of feature films, designed so that Hollywood could police itself and thus avoid or minimize outside censorship. It began as advisory at first, but quickly became more obligatory thanks to outside pressures. This code required all film producers and distributors to submit their scripts in advance of production for censorship by the MPPDA, and to submit their films for code approval before release. Without this approval, their films would not be released, or they were forced to pay expensive fines. The code sets up high standards of performance for motion picture producers, Hays proclaimed. It states the considerations which good taste and community value make necessary in this universal form of entertainment. The PCA thought of literally everything when creating the 36 prohibitions. One of the most ridiculous violations in the code was no glamorizing the act of safe cracking, making even Paul Blart Mall Cop a wildly inappropriate movie by the Hays standards. Things like vulgarity, sex, murder, obscenity, profanity, and religion had standardized ways that they were to be represented under the code for audiences. For example, when shooting a murder scene, it was imperative that the technique of murder must be presented in a way that will not inspire imitation, and brutal killings are not to be shown in detail. One of the most famous examples of code censorship includes the $5,000 fine David O. Selznick had to pay in 1939 because Rhett Butler says the all-too-famous line, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," in Gone with the Wind, rather than the code office's preferred, "Frankly, my dear, I just don't care." Doesn't quite have the same ring. In the case of sex, it was deemed that the sanctity of the institution of marriage shall be upheld. Scenes of passion, seduction, and lustful kissing were forbidden. One of the most confusing violations under the sex category states that white slavery shall not be treated, with no mention of the enslavement of any other race anywhere else in the list. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure there were no Quentin Tarantinos in the 1930s making alternative history, Once Upon a Time in White Slavery films. So, what is white slavery, and why is it mentioned in the Hays Code at all? There's really not a lot of scholarly work on the topic to say it's one thing over another, but film historians and scholars of the era seem to think it's one of two possible meanings. The first is taking the term white slavery literally, meaning prohibiting the visual representation of the enslavement of white people. This explanation of white slavery can be backed up by the next point on the list of prohibiting miscegenation, or the sexual relationship between people of white and black races. It wasn't until 1957 that the first interracial kiss was seen on film with Island in the Sun, and then for the first time in television in 1968 with, of course, Star Trek. The history of black representation, and particularly the depiction of slavery in film, is long and complex. It's not like the introduction of the Hays Code and white slavery prohibition stopped depicting slavery altogether. In fact, it didn't even slow it down. The economic depression that began in 1929 encouraged interest in the lost world of the southern plantation. Hard times and high industrial unemployment made the seemingly timeless rural way of life in the antebellum South appear especially appealing. To those suffering economic instability or threatened by unemployment in cities, the romantic myth of the Old South was a highly seductive one. Audiences could marvel, observed Edward D.C. Campbell Jr., at a culture so reliant on the land and the seasons, rather than on the city and business trends. As the 1930s continued through the Depression, the plantations themselves became even grander. Hollywood's representation of the Old South became a complex negotiation between filmmakers' desires and ambitions, previous productions, and what spectators now had been led to accept. The relatively small and intimate plantations in Carolina, 1934, and So Red the Rose, 1935, paved the road for far more impressive bastions of the pre-Reconstruction South, like Halcyon Plantation of Jezebel, and, of course, Tara and 12 Oaks in Gone with the Wind. These films also had a race problem. They depicted happy slaves loyally supporting their masters and mistresses, and not a factual representation of the institution of slavery and its very real effect on human beings. Why bring down the beauty of the fantasy with the ugliness of the reality? The only film of this kind that, at least to some degree, kind of contradicted this portrayal was So Red the Rose in 1935. The film portrayed slaves who stopped working for their master and family and, encouraged by their leader Cato, played by Clarence Muse, start to seize the livestock of their owners. But this slave revolt is easily put down by the daughter of the plantation owner, played by Margaret Sullivan, who confronts Cato and reduces him to silence by evoking memories of the strong interracial bonds that had supposedly existed under slavery. Let's just take a moment of silence to reflect on that complete and utter insanity. Ultimately, this brief moment of Black agency fails to undermine Hollywood's trope of slavery as intrinsically a benign institution. Gone with the Wind was probably the most successful in commercial and cultural terms to stick to this racial status quo. It offers a number of benign images of slavery. We have the black foreman, Big Sam, played by Everett Brown, who, in an unlikely assertion of racial autonomy, calls quittin' time in the cotton fields of Tara. Mammy, played by Hattie McDaniel, although a slave, is clearly a welcome social presence in the household. Pork, played by Oscar Polk, has been close enough to Gerald O'Hara, played by Thomas Mitchell, to inherit his former master's watch. House slaves are allowed to attend evening prayers at Tara. Big Sam and other field hands cheerfully go off at one point, quote, to dig trenches for the Confederacy, making them willing participants in their own continuing enslavement. A few of the plantation films of the 1930s and 1940s, like Gone with the Wind, have had a long legacy. Prolific comic book writer Jack Kirby described Disney's Song of the South as the ultimate expression of plantation harmony after the Shirley Temple movies. That film continued to be shown in some movie theaters until the mid-1970s. So, if all of these extremely popular and well-known films depicting slavery passed the bar of the Hays Code, we're still left here pondering white slavery. Now, as a concept, white slavery is about as real as reverse racism, and it's why I bet you can't depict one film with the theme. Not to say there weren't films in the 1930s and 40s whose plot focused on a white person being enslaved in some way, albeit there are very few. One of the more well-known films is 1935's Captain Blood. This swashbuckling blockbuster from First National Pictures and Warner Brothers starred an up-and-coming Errol Flynn as Peter Blood. The entire plot focuses on an enslaved white Irish doctor and his fellow prisoners who escape their cruel Caribbean island imprisonment and become pirates in the West Indies. This was a remake of an earlier 1924 silent film of the same name. Another example is 1928's The Viking, directed by Roy William Neill, about a white nobleman named Lord Alwyn, Earl of Northumbria, who was captured in a Viking raid and taken to Norway as a slave. He proves to be a troublesome slave throughout the film and nearly killed for his insolence. But through the power of true love and valor of the nobles, everything ends up okay and Lord Alwyn lives. The end of the movie also has a rousing chorus of God Bless America, and goes to show that white slavery is actually a good thing for finding a new country, I guess? It's very confusing, and I recommend watching it to disassociate from reality completely. All this to say, if white slavery is taken in this literal term, it's odd, but not shocking that two popular films of the era depicting white slaves end in sword fights, true love, and I guess discovering the United States of America? Compared to the Black experience, there's not only a major disconnect, but leaves us asking more questions about the Hays Code meaning in the term white slavery. This brings us to the second and most common understanding of the term. According to some film historians and scholars, white slavery is a term from the late 19th century, generally referring to the act of prostitution. There were stories published at the time serving as a warning to the innocent, virtuous white women being lured to the depths of depravity by predatory men. This idea being that the wholesome white woman would never, ever voluntarily submit her virtue willingly, so they were slaves controlled by their pimps. Again, there's not a lot of discourse on this being the true meaning of the phrase, but we can take the films being made at the time to put some context here. In 1910, Congress passed the Mann Act, allowing federal power to intervene in cases of sex trafficking. 1913's Traffic in Souls perpetuated a common narrative of deception and kidnapping as the fundamental traits of the white prostitute. Other media emphasized the connection between prostitution and other vices, such as the 1912 book From Dance Hall to White Slavery, The World's Greatest Tragedy, which made the connection to drinking and moral decay. This would also be a reaffirming definition for the term and why it's under the sexual perversion category in the list. Looking back over a century later, it's obvious that much of this moral panic over white slavery covered several other social anxieties. The common narrative of the good, white, girl lured into the big, bad city speaks volumes about concerns over the decline of rural America and the explosive growth of cities during industrialization. The racial components of white slavery were not only explicit in its name, but also with the enforcement of the Mann Act. The most famous example of this was when black boxer Jack Johnson was prosecuted under the Mann Act for transporting white women across state lines. Journalist George Kib Turner also asserted Jewish immigrants were behind the surge of prostitution enabled by the immigrant-friendly machine of New York City's Tammany Hall. While sex trafficking and forced prostitution certainly did occur in turn-of-the-century US, discussions of white slavery tended to assert that there was exclusively a racist overtone behind the phenomenon. The Hays Code was a way to both satisfy state and federal demands that Hollywood reel in its depictions of morally questionable activities, as well as add social respectability to the burgeoning film industry. White slavery, in this case, meant prohibiting all depictions of prostitution or other sex work on screen. This led to some creative finagling for some movies where the original source materials were more explicit, but the film was forced to tone them down. Gone with the Wind's character Belle, for instance, is a brothel madam in the novel, but runs a quote social club where men drink and gamble in the film version. Likewise, Alma in From Here to Eternity is a private dancer and hostess, and not a sex worker, which was one of many changes to the novel to fit the Hays Code, which greatly annoyed the author James Jones. This gave the script plausible deniability to their occupation to make it past the MPPDA cutting room floor. Look, it's no secret the film industry as a whole has decades of racial and gender inequality to address and rectify in the coming years. While white slavery as a concept may be laughable now, and truly it is, the repercussions of the Hays Code have led to lasting inequality on screen, behind the camera, and in representation in storylines themselves. Recent studies as of 2022 show that black actors comprise 12.9% of leading roles in cable scripted shows. The numbers behind the scenes aren't as encouraging either, with only 6% of writers, directors, and producers of US films identifying as black. In 2015, there was the now infamous Oscars So White fiasco, highlighting just how little black and minority stories and creators are represented in the eyes of Hollywood. Before Oscars So White, 92% of the top film directors were men, and 86% of top films featured white actors, according to a study by the University of Southern California.
These four men and Greta Gerwig created their own masterpieces this year.
I guess it starts with the narrative or the ideology that black films are unbankable, or even films that are non-white directed films are unbankable, said Marianne Arriga, author of The Hollywood Jim Crow, The Racial Politics of the Movie Industry. Arriga argues that these days, the colorblind language of economics lets Hollywood hide its racial biases. Instead, Hollywood executives like to locate inequality in the past. Even films featuring black talent, such as Black Panther and 12 Years a Slave, may be cases where the exception proves the rule, says Arriga. Although one or two films may find success, Hollywood's overall structure remains the same, and pointing to a few examples keeps people from looking at the bigger picture. And the same can be said for women. This narrative of the frail, innocent white woman being lured to the dark side by men, and often men of color, throughout history has had an incredibly damaging legacy in the media we consume, our social makeup, and our politics. Hollywood can't make steps toward inequality until it addresses its racist past. And that includes calling out the concept of white slavery for what it is: complete and total whiny bullshit.